Welcome to this webinar on supporting children with attention and focus, aimed at teachers and support staff in both primary and secondary schools. My name is Isabel Turner, and I am Psychology Assistant for the Xavier Catholic Education Trust. I have a degree in psychology, and I work closely with our educational psychologist, Dr. Alison DeMario. As we go through this webinar, I want you to reflect on the students that you work with who really struggle with their attention. But I also want you to keep in mind that the human capability of paying attention really fluctuates day to day based on circumstances. And therefore, the information in this webinar will likely be applicable to all of the students you work with at some point during their school life. Try not to limit yourself to considering only those students with diagnoses of disorders like ADHD. In this session, we are going to cover what is meant by attention and focus, how difficulties with attention and focus may present themselves in the classroom, the possible underlying reasons for these difficulties. We'll take a closer look at some of the disorders associated with inattention, and finally look at some strategies that you can use to support those students who struggle with their attention. Psychologist William James wrote The Principles of Psychology in 1890, which includes a chapter solely focused on the concept of attention. He was a philosopher as well as a psychologist, so this is a pretty wordy definition, but it captures what is meant when we refer to attention in psychological terms. So he said, attention is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one out of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. Focalization, concentration of consciousness are of its essence. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, and is a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, scatterbrained state, which in French is called distraction, and Zerstreitheit in German, the direct translation of which is absent-mindedness. And apologies if I just butchered that pronunciation there. Essentially what James is saying is that most of the time we are able to attend to one item at a time, and in doing so we withdraw our focus from multiple other things in the background. Think of the times when you've had to get work done in your classroom. It's lunchtime and students are outside being loud. But generally speaking, you are able to tune out those distractions and get the work done, because you choose to attend to the work at hand. The ability to attend to information varies from person to person and situation to situation. For example, some people can listen to music while they work, and others need complete silence. Personally, I never used to understand how my sister could get completely engrossed in a book on a long car journey, whereas I could barely look at a page without getting distracted by my dad blasting the radio, my mum chatting away, the cars going past the window on the motorway, or just feeling car sick every time I look down for too long. So when it comes to attention, everyone is different. In summary, attention refers to how we actively process specific information in our environment. As I mentioned before, it is selective. That is, we choose what we attend to, be it consciously or subconsciously. But it's not only about centering our focus on one particular thing, it also requires us to ignore and filter out irrelevant information and stimuli. Pause this video now and search for the selective attention test on YouTube, then click on the first result and follow the instructions in the clip. For those of you who are unable to view the YouTube video, the selective attention test, otherwise known as the invisible gorilla test, involves showing participants a video of two teams, one in black t-shirts and one in white t-shirts, passing a ball between themselves. Participants are instructed to count the number of times the ball is passed between the players in white. But midway through the video, a gorilla walks through the game, stands in the middle, pounds his chest, and then exits. You'd expect to see this, right? Well, not necessarily. In the initial experiment conducted in 1999, 46% of participants missed the gorilla entirely. You may have spotted him yourselves, but this could have something to do with an underlying awareness that you needed to pay extra close attention to something in the video. Nevertheless, the experiment is an excellent demonstration of selective attention in action. Attention also has limited capacity and duration, And there's no clear-cut rule, but some researchers say that children can pay attention to a task of interest for around 2 to 3 minutes per year of life. So a 10-year-old, in theory, could concentrate on a task for anywhere between 20 and 30 minutes if they're interested in it. These factors can be broken down into 3 different types of attention. The first is focused attention, which obviously refers to our ability to focus attention on a stimulus. Sustained attention is the ability to attend to a stimulus or activity over a long period of time, and selective attention is the ability to attend to a specific stimulus or activity in the presence of other distracting stimuli. By definition, focus is the main or central point of something, especially of attention or interest. So essentially it refers to the object of our attention. I may use focus and attention and concentration interchangeably myself throughout this webinar, but essentially I'm referring to the same thing. Now I'd like us to think about how attention difficulties present themselves. And these issues are not limited to the classroom, so we will first consider them more generally before we address this question in relation to the classroom setting. Some of the features of inattention are: the individual often finds it difficult to settle to a task. They're easily distracted by extraneous or unnecessary stimuli. They're often forgetful and disorganised. They may appear to not listen to what is being said to them, and they may frequently lose things that are necessary for activities at home or at school. They might also be fairly noisy and talkative, and therefore pose a distraction to others, be restless, fidgety, and continually on the go, have a tendency to interrupt conversations, talk out of turn, or answer questions before they have been completed, which can come across as fairly rude traits if you aren't aware of the underpinnings of the behaviour. Pause the video now to think about the children that you work with and consider these questions. How do these issues manifest themselves in the classroom? What do you tend to see in terms of the amount of work they get done? How are their relationships with others? And how do they appear emotionally? This is by no means an exhaustive list, but a student with attention difficulties is, first of all, likely to struggle to complete tasks and makes careless mistakes in their work. It can be really easy to misconstrue these behaviours as laziness, and granted, sometimes it is just laziness. But we've got to be careful and vigilant as teachers and support staff in identifying when the root of the problem may be beyond the student's control. Refusal to do work is also commonplace. Bear in mind that this is an avoidance tactic used by students when they're struggling as a means of self-preservation. Many students would rather not do the work at all than attempt the work and fail. These students may also interrupt the teacher and distract others' learning, be it by talking, fidgeting, calling out, etc., etc. And they may seem extremely tired and withdrawn. They may just generally appear to have behaviour problems, and you might find yourself having to tell them off more than the average student because their behaviour comes across as rude or disrespectful. They tend to have weaker communication skills, finding it difficult to understand what people are telling or asking them, and likewise finding it difficult to express themselves. And this may feed into the wider issue of difficulties in making and maintaining peer relationships. This could be for a number of reasons. For example, students with attention difficulties can, unfortunately, get on the nerves of other students. They might inadvertently get them in trouble or distract them from their work, and just generally disrupt the lesson. They're also vulnerable to being at the brunt of jokes, and according to a Swedish study conducted in 2008, children with ADHD are 10 times more likely to be victims of bullying compared to their neurotypical counterparts. So there are a lot of ways that inattention can manifest itself in the classroom, and in the next slide we're going to consider some of the possible underlying causes of these difficulties. I want you to try and remember this quote as we take a look at the potential causes of inattention. Teachers and parents should understand that the inconsistency of children with attention problems is not evidence of a poor attitude or lack of motivation. It is a part of their biologically based attention dysfunction and is beyond their easy control. So, the first and perhaps most obvious cause is attention disorders, and these include diagnoses like ADHD and ADD. However, ADD, attention deficit disorder, is now considered an outdated term. Other neurological issues associated with attention difficulties include poor working memory, difficulties with executive functioning, receptive language difficulties, and sensory processing challenges, all of which we will look at in greater detail in the following slides. Sometimes the explanation behind inattention may be as simple as sleep problems. This could be one bad night's sleep, or they could be persistent and enduring problems like insomnia. Trouble sleeping and ADHD are also tightly interwoven, with 1 in 2 ADHD individuals suffering from sleep problems, thus exacerbating the problem. Likewise, sleep problems may also be associated with negative life events and experiences, and other emotional disorders such as anxiety and depression, all of which may also be standalone underlying causes of attention difficulties in school children. We're now going to take a closer look at attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and attention deficit disorder. Once again, I'd like to emphasise that there are a number of other possible explanations, and difficulties with attention do not always warrant a clinical diagnosis of ADHD. That being said, these statistics demonstrate just how commonplace ADHD is. It's been reported that ADHD affects around 3 to 5% of school-aged children in the UK, and that equates to 1 in every class of 30. Diagnosis is most commonly received around the age of 7, with higher rates reported among males than females. Typically, 4 boys are diagnosed for every 1 girl, although I have seen the figure as high as 6 to 1 in some places. There could be a number of reasons for this, but the most common explanation is that male behaviour is usually expressed in a more visible, sometimes aggressive and troublesome way, and therefore it's more outwardly obvious in boys than it is in girls. Girls are also proportionally more likely to be diagnosed in the inattention subgroup than boys are. And staggeringly, more than 2/3 of individuals with ADHD have at least one other coexisting condition. We will take a closer look at these in a moment. For many years, ADHD was considered a purely developmental disorder, something that people would probably grow out of. But in reality, around 2% of adults are also affected worldwide. And according to the NHS website, by the age of 25, an estimated 15% of people diagnosed with ADHD as children will still have a full range of symptoms, and 65% still have symptoms that affect their daily lives. So it's a really complex and sometimes misunderstood condition, and that's why it's so important that we as practitioners understand it. Fortunately, or unfortunately, whichever way you look at it, rates of diagnosis have increased over the last few decades. This is likely the result of increased public awareness, improved access to treatment, and changing clinical practices. But what actually is ADHD? It's a disorder characterised by severe inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity that is more frequent and severe than is typically observed in individuals at a comparable level of development. There is no single risk factor or explanation for the disorder. It has multiple potential origins, and complex interactions are at play. Research by NICE in 2008 and 2013 shows that parents and siblings of a child with ADHD are more likely to have ADHD themselves, indicating that there is a heritable component. Brain imaging studies have also highlighted differences in the size and shape of specific areas of the brain, and other studies have suggested an imbalance or dysfunction of certain neurotransmitters. There are also a number of high-risk groups, including those born prematurely or with a low birth weight, those with epilepsy, and those with brain damage, either in the womb or as a result of severe injury later in life. And there are 3 primary subtypes of the disorder: predominantly hyperactive impulsive type, predominantly inattentive type, and the most common, combined type. Lots of children exhibit these symptoms, but what sets them apart from others is that they are typically unremitting, persistent, and present wherever they are, be it at school, home, and with friends. And I feel like when we talk about ADHD, there are a lot of negative associations with the disorder, but actually there are also so many positive attributes that come along with it. People with ADHD are often quite extroverted, they're outgoing, tenacious, spontaneous, and creative, and they may channel that overactivity into occupations or sports that really value those qualities. These students have so much going for them and so much potential, they just need the right support. As I mentioned before, an overwhelming 2/3 of young people with ADHD have another disorder as well. These are most commonly behavioural, such as oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. But according to the ADHD Foundation, other associated disorders include tics, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, anxiety, substance misuse, autism, and learning difficulties. 1 in 2 will also suffer from sleep problems. All of the above are likely to also be associated with attention difficulties themselves, so we must consider the complex interplay between ADHD with a number of other disorders that may feed into inattention and thus enhance the effects. One of the key messages I want you to take from this session is this. Children with ADHD are not naughty children. They are children with a disability. Likewise, struggling with attention in general is not a choice, nor is it boredom or rudeness, and we need to appreciate that the student is more than likely not doing it on purpose. We will take a look at the other possible causes of this deficit in the following slide. So another possible explanation of inattention is poor working memory. And when we talk about working memory, we're referring to a cognitive system with a limited capacity that can hold information temporarily. This information is then used to aid our reasoning and decision making without losing track of the task at hand. So in your head, I'd like you now to add 27 and 14 together, then subtract 8 from the sum. Your working memory allows you to hold on to and visualise the numbers I just said, and it also allows you to retain the answer to the first sum so that you can then take away 8. For those of you who are wondering, you should have ended up with 33. The message here though is that chances are if I asked you in half an hour what the numbers were, you would have forgotten. But that's okay, because your working memory has succeeded in its short-term job and you are able to tackle the task at hand. The link that this has with attention is that paying attention is a necessary and integral part of the process. According to a study by Gathacol et al. In 2006, children with poor working memory are rarely described by their teachers as actually having memory problems. Rather, they typically report them as having attentional problems. Phrases like in one ear and out the other, and just doesn't listen to a word I say, were more likely to be used to explain their behaviour. Another study has found that children with short working memory spans are more likely to engage in mind wandering when performing demanding cognitive tasks. This kind of zoning out seemingly occurs when the working memory is so overloaded that it can no longer retain the information needed to guide the ongoing activity. As a result, children shift their attention away from the task at hand, and ultimately, this inattention masks the internal issue of working memory dysfunction. Now we're going to take a look at executive functioning. And executive functioning refers to a set of cognitive skills that are necessary to help us learn, work, and manage day-to-day life. Children are not born with these skills, but rather they are born with the potential to develop them. Poor relationships with adults, adverse conditions in their environment, and exposure to toxic stress during childhood can disrupt and impair the successful development of these executive functions. Dysfunction in any one of these areas, and there are several, can have a knock-on effect on a child's learning, and problems can persist into adulthood, affecting an individual's ability to work, be independent, or maintain relationships. This is a really nice diagram to give you an insight into what we mean when we refer to executive functioning. It's quite a broad term that encompasses a number of essential skills, including working memory, self-monitoring and self-awareness, planning, task initiation, organisation, impulse control, which is the ability to think before we act and inhibit behaviours that will elicit a negative response, emotional control, and flexible thinking, so being able to adjust to changes and sustain or shift attention in response to different demands or settings. So, sustained attention is a central element of executive functioning. Moreover, when there is dysfunction in one or more of these areas, it can often present itself as an attention deficit, much like we saw when we looked specifically at working memory. So, outwardly, children may appear to find it difficult to concentrate on the teacher or focus on the task at hand, but at the root of the problem, they might be struggling to understand and control their emotions, or they may be finding it difficult to plan and organise their thoughts, or adjust to new situations if they've experienced a change, perhaps something as simple as a change of seating plan. A child with receptive language difficulties or a diagnosis of a receptive language disorder has difficulties with understanding the meaning of language. Comprehension difficulties often present themselves before the age of 3, and in many cases this comes hand in hand with expressive language disorder, whereby children struggle to use spoken language too. Symptoms of receptive language disorder or difficulties include not seeming to listen when they are spoken to, appearing to lack interest when people are talking, either at home or in school, having trouble following directions, particularly when they're spoken, and often misunderstanding or misinterpreting what is asked or said to them. As you've probably noticed, the underlying issue with all of these symptoms is that they look just like attention problems, and so receptive language difficulties are another possible cause of attention problems. And finally, sensory processing challenges occur when the brain misinterprets sensory information and the body responds in an atypical way. Children may hyper-respond or overreact to sensory input, or alternatively they may hypo-respond or underreact to sensory information. And this can be a reaction to the basic senses, sight, sound, touch, taste and smell, but it can also link to other senses such as position in space, movement and balance, and the inner body. These children will probably fatigue easily, and their activity and energy levels will fluctuate, as will their attention and focus. Just pause for a moment now and think about what affects your own concentration and attention levels on a day-to-day basis. Have you had a bad night's sleep? Did you receive some bad news? Or maybe had an argument the night before? Of course, what I'm getting at here is that alongside these neurological disorders that may explain inattention, there could also be a number of other factors at play, or a combination of multiple things. So here I've highlighted sleep problems, emotional problems and disorders, and life events or experiences. Any one of these issues could impact any student at any time, just like they impact all of us. And they may be enduring issues that affect them constantly for really long periods, or they may just affect them on one single occasion or for a few days at a time here and there. We all know what it feels like to have a bad night's sleep and to have to come into work the next day. We feel groggy, our patience wears thin, our mood is low, and our capacity to pay attention and stay focused on tasks is limited. This happens to children too. There's no rule, and it's certainly not the same for everyone, but the NHS website recommends children aged 6 to 12 years old need approximately 9 to 12 hours of sleep, and teenagers need around 8 to 10 hours. This is a particular challenge in the present day. Not only do we have access to more technology than ever before, we've got phones, iPads, laptops, PlayStations, social media, but there's also so much going on in the world at the moment, the pandemic in particular, and all of these can interrupt our ability to switch off and relax and fall asleep. Often the worries that keep us up at night are subconscious, and so children may not even know why they're struggling. Sleep problems are also closely linked to emotional problems and mental health, but obviously, emotional problems and mental health are also a standalone issue in relation to attention. According to the Mental Health Foundation website, 10% of children and young people aged 5 to 17 years have a clinically diagnosable mental health problem. Any mental health issue, be it diagnosed or undiagnosed, takes up an enormous amount of brain space. For example, a child with anxiety may be totally consumed by thoughts about getting into trouble, making mistakes in their work, who they're going to hang out with at break time, to name just a few things, and there are so many more. Likewise, a child with an eating disorder may be focused entirely on what they're going to eat next, worrying about having to eat in front of other students, or what the number was on the scale that morning. And sadly, these issues are debilitating in a number of ways. And certainly, attention levels are compromised when a child is experiencing mental health problems, whatever they may be. As I've mentioned a number of times, comorbidity is extremely common between lots of disorders, including ADHD, and therefore it may be the case that a child is experiencing a number of issues at once, which is likely to enhance their effects. I'd finally just like to touch upon the effects of life events and experiences, and these too may have long-term or short-term effects on young people and can be closely linked to sleep problems, mental health and emotional well-being. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, was a term coined by researchers in the 90s, and it's used to describe the negative experiences that can severely impact child development and outcomes. These include, but are not limited to, abuse, neglect, bereavement, domestic violence, family illness, parental divorce or separation, parental mental health issues, or a member of the household being in prison. But these life experiences do not always need to be serious and traumatic to have a significant effect on a child. It may be the case that they've had an argument with a parent the night before, had a fallout with a friend, or got a test result that they weren't happy with. And all of these may seem trivial to some people, but the emotions and thoughts that they elicit can feel all-consuming to a child or young person, and this may be evidenced in their ability to pay attention in school. So now we're going to take a look at some strategies that you can implement to support children with attention and focus difficulties in the classroom and beyond. First of all, allow time for movement breaks. And in primary school, it's easier to take a whole class approach to this. You can get your students to stand up for a minute or two and encourage them to jump, dance, or shake it out on the spot. But alternatively, to avoid doing something too stimulating, at random points throughout your lesson, you could get them to stop what they're doing and put their hands on their head or repeat a clapping pattern back to you. These small breaks allow them to refocus their attention when you see it dwindling and release any built-up energy. In both primary and secondary schools, seek out opportunities for regular seat breaks for those with attention difficulties. For example, giving them in-class jobs like handing out books or worksheets, or coming up to write answers on the whiteboard. Timeout cards can also provide an opportunity for a brief reset outside the classroom. Just reinforce that you will always respect their need for a timeout, so long as they utilise their card sensibly and respectfully in return. Next, consider seating plans to aid learning. Simple things like where the student is positioned in the classroom can make a huge difference to their learning. Ensure they are seated with less distractible students who are likely to follow the teacher's instructions and not reinforce the student's distracting behaviours. You can seat them near the front of the classroom, away from doors, windows, and out of the way of more frequently used walkways. And in some situations, it may be useful to have a spare desk available for the student to work at independently, facing away from the rest of the class and out of the way of other students and distractions. But try to use this only as and when needed, so as not to isolate the young person from their peers. Likewise, try to minimise noise and distraction to give students the best possible chance at staying focused. Try not to set up difficult tasks that require a lot of thinking when there is excessive noise going on outside the classroom, like during lunch times for other year groups, and keep noise levels within the classroom to a minimum too. Sticking to a regular routine and maintaining structure makes students feel safe and secure, and changes simply create distraction, uncertainty, and confusion. It may be helpful to tape a timetable to a student's desk to keep them aware of what to expect next, and prepare and plan for changes in advance, keeping the student in the loop so that they feel ready and are not caught unawares when changes happen. Next up, encourage good organisation. When students are working on projects, you can draw up a checklist to ensure every point is covered. Likewise, checklists can be attached to the inside of their workbooks, reminding them to underline headings, write the date, title, and check spelling. Task boards can also be really helpful to break work down into more manageable chunks, but we will take a look at these in a little more detail in a moment. Variety keeps things interesting, so whether this is the tone and pace of your voice, method of delivery, or the activities and tasks you use, to keep students focused, mix these up. So vary your use of videos, group tasks, written tasks, drawing, role play, etc., throughout the lesson. And changing the style of activity gives students another opportunity to refocus their attention if it begins to waver. Visual cues, such as images or gestures, are particularly helpful for those with receptive language difficulties who may struggle to understand verbal information. Use images of previous students' work to give them an example of what is expected of them, and it can also be really helpful to demonstrate things such as scientific experiments or art techniques before sending students off to do them themselves. Learning support assistants can make cue cards or a visual timetable to help students get prepared at the start of the lesson. These can be as simple as a picture of a pencil case, exercise book, iPad, and will remind them what to take out of their bag as soon as they're in the room. There are lots of resources online that could be tailored to primary, secondary, and SEN students, and it's all about finding what works for the individual. Finally, ensure that your instructions are as specific and clear as possible. We're going to take a closer look at how to give effective instructions now. In 2007, Gailey published these instructions on giving clear instructions to students with ADHD. Ensure that you make frequent use of students' names to ensure that they know when you are addressing them. Stand close and maintain eye contact when giving instructions. Be specific and direct, so try not to give any unnecessary information that may distract or confuse them. For example, rather than simply saying, "Start the questions now," say, "Oliver, open your textbook to page 32 and answer questions 1 to 7 in your exercise book." Where possible, illustrate or write instructions in addition to speaking them. If you can, leave these on the board so that the student can refer back to them if they need. Remember that visuals are particularly useful for students with receptive language difficulties who struggle to understand verbal information. And finally, develop rapport with the students and take time to understand what they enjoy and how they work best in order to gain their trust and respect in return. Where there is good rapport between teachers and students, practical strategies are more likely to be effective. Some of the following techniques are particularly useful if inattention is linked to working memory weaknesses. Firstly, encourage students to connect information or concepts that are being presented. For example, by creating a link between Henry VIII and Horrid Henry, students are more likely to remember other key pieces of information about him, such as having 6 wives and beheading 2 of them. A mnemonic is a memory device that helps us to remember key facts and large amounts of information, particularly when they need to be remembered in a certain order. They come in many forms, including songs, rhymes, and acronyms. I personally have never forgotten the order of the planets thanks to the mnemonic. My very easy method just speeds up naming planets, as you can see in the picture here, and the word planets obviously now accounts for Pluto. Remember to repeat directions individually using the guidance in the previous slide. And more visual ways of learning can also be beneficial, so using visual maps, like taking notes in the form of a mind map, as well as colour coding of information, using flashcards and post-it notes. These can help students to link information, aid their memory, and keep them engaged. I've mentioned task boards previously, and they're a really useful tool to help students break down pieces of work into more manageable chunks. There are lots of templates online, or you can help them to draw up their own so that it's perfectly tailored to them and their needs. I've included an example on the board here. So you've got reminders for things like spelling and grammar along the top, as well as space for objectives and a checklist. All of these ideas are particularly helpful for those students with memory-related attention deficits, but really they can benefit any student who is struggling. And this here is just one more example of a task planner that is a free resource on the ADHD Foundation website. It just demonstrates that there are lots of ways to break down tasks, and personally I really like the addition of the clock to help visualise timeframes, and the rewards section is a great asset as well. These are just some final tips that I want to leave you with. Children with conditions like ADHD really struggle to socialise and maintain friendships. It can be a very isolating condition. The main thing is, don't give up on them. Be patient and tolerant, and other students will follow your example. Empowering these students and showing them that you believe in them is one of the most powerful tools you have. Similarly, take time to properly get to know your students and understand what they enjoy. Leverage their interests and use them to your advantage in tasks. If it's difficult to get them to write creatively about a random topic, get them to write about something that they enjoy or are passionate about, because producing any piece of work, on topic or not, is always better than them producing nothing at all. Likewise, if it's a challenge to get them to write notes on a topic or a story, allow them to draw pictures or storyboard it instead. When it comes to encouraging good sleep and nutrition, obviously there is only so much we can do. We can't implement sleep strategies, but we can encourage them. So one way we can do this is by helping them to draw up a before bed plan. For example, have a relaxing bath, a hot drink, reading and switching their phone off. A sleep diary template that will help them reflect on the sleep they've had and how they feel as a result can be found on the ADHD Foundation website, along with loads of other resources. Next up, as previously mentioned, sensory needs tend to come hand in hand with attention difficulties, and some children might benefit through rhythmic movement, move and sit cushions, things to chew on, doodling, and fidget toys, to name just a few. It might be helpful to create a sensory checklist to help both you and the student understand what they are sensitive to and how they respond to certain sensory inputs. This can then be used to inform which activities may help them in the classroom. The OT Toolbox website has some amazing resources for this. Finally, and most importantly, difficulty maintaining attention could be the first indicator of a much bigger issue. Always be vigilant and notice changes in student behaviour, especially when they're out of character. That way, we can provide the help a child or young person needs as quickly as possible. I've mentioned quite a few resources throughout this webinar. They're all listed here if you need any tools or further guidance. And of course, if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to contact myself or Ali for more help. Thank you so much for listening.